So this is the third of 4 lectures on the Revolutionary period that I'm going to give. I often forget to tell people who I am because I recognize so many of you. My name's John Foster. I'm an adult information services librarian here at the library. I have a PhD in European history I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington. My specialty was Europe. If you watch TV on Saturday mornings in the 1970s and 1980s, you heard this lovely little song. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. And it's funny, like, I can now just, sometimes I'll find myself reciting the preamble to the Constitution just randomly. I wish I could play this because it has a really lovely little tune that goes with it. But it's a really kind of a useful thing. If you're going to remember anything, the preamble to the Constitution is a pretty good thing to remember because it really sets out some very important things about what they were trying to do with this document. As I got older, I remember having this argument with my dad about how the country didn't live up to this. That there was a difference between what was said here and things that happened. And he said, yeah, of course, there's always going to be. But the point is that it's aspirational, right? This is what we're trying to do. And sure, we don't live up. That's the way human beings are. We have ideals. We don't fulfill them necessarily. But we always have this sort of hanging out as a thing that we're supposed to be doing and a way of sort of checking ourselves. Are we really living up to the idea that is what we're doing institutionally? I mean, okay, provide for the common defense. That's a pretty straightforward one. But promote the general welfare. What does it mean to promote the general welfare? And we've had a long sort of national conversation, an ongoing conversation about what that means that stretches back to even before the Constitution itself was actually promulgated. In 1787, the Revolutionary War had been over for 5 years, roughly. The United States basically at this point was a confederacy. Prior to the war, the various colonies had really operated as sovereign states. And they were very jealous of their sovereignty. I mean, they had started in different ways. They all had their own legislatures. They all had their own political cultures. There was a very rough kind of regional separation so that the northern states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, which for a long time was a part of Massachusetts, had one sort of culture, and the southern states. Now you notice that I didn't mention Pennsylvanians because a lot of times when things got tough, the southerners say, well, probably Pennsylvania will come with us, which is an odd sort of thing to think as things turned out. But basically everything south of the Mason-Dixon line, which is the northern border of the state of Maryland, for those of you who don't know. Maryland, Virginia. Virginia at this point went out to here. Later that became Kentucky. North Carolina, which sort of controlled the area that became Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia. And the rest of this is controlled by Spain. And this was a big issue at the time, which we'll get to in a minute. But what happened sort of during the Revolutionary War was that a lot of the leading politicians, so the Continental Congress had been formed. They decided in the course of trying to prosecute the war that what they needed was a document that was going to allow the several colonies to operate as a single unit. And this was the Articles of Confederation, which were debated in Congress between 1776 and 1778, and finally sort of ratified in 1781. And the Articles of Confederation are a really interesting and little remembered document at this point. Basically, it was a good deal for the country as it was structured then. One of the things, I love this line, this is from Article 4. To better secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of different states of the Union, the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens of the several states. So what it did was, essentially said, the central government is going to be able to be the arbiter of war and peace, and it's going to be able to sign treaties that everyone is going to have to more or less abide by. But it didn't really, it left some gaps, and partly this was because of the fact that it was sort of put together in the course of trying to fight this very complex war against the British. The states were very interested to defend their own sovereignty, and The idea that states were individual countries was something that had real currency in the United States even through the 1860s, as when the Civil War broke out. A number of, there are quotes you can read, particularly from Robert E. Lee, about Virginia being his country as opposed to the United States. Robert E. Lee was offered the generalship of the Union armies and turned it down. Military forces under the Articles of Confederation were to be raised and controlled by the states. There was to be minimal standing armies. So once again, this is something that the American colonists were very nervous about in terms of how they were going to organize themselves, because what they didn't want was an army running around being able to sort of step on their rights and liberties. But it quickly, or fairly quickly after the end of the war, became clear that the Articles had a number of very pronounced weaknesses. One was taxation. No taxation power was built into the Articles of Confederation, so that the federal government could requisition funds from the states, but the states would, it wasn't exactly voluntary, but there was no power to compel the states to pay. This was a fairly considerable problem. First of all, because the United States, in the course of fighting the war, had contracted very large debts, some to foreign banks, to practically anybody who would lend them money. I mean, this was one of the sort of enduring problems of the United States fighting or the colonies fighting the Revolutionary War, or the War of Independence, was trying to find somebody who believed enough that they would at some point be paid back to actually lend us money. But also they put out bonds, basically. And so there were a lot of bondholders in the United States. If you ever read Charles Beard's The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, this is a sort of an older book, and there's been a lot of debate about it. People have a little bit moved on from his ideas, but his view basically was, if you want to understand why the Constitution was what it was, look at who the country owed money to. And basically his argument was that it was that the Constitution was basically promulgated in order to ensure repayment of bondholders, which is a somewhat jaundiced way of thinking about it, but there you go. Taxation became a fairly considerable problem in the sense that, number one, central government would say, well, we want you to pay these taxes, and you cannot pay it in paper money. By the way, like, just for those of you who are interested in the kind of monetary theory, the reason that the government issues money, partly it's to facilitate trade, but partly it's so you can pay your taxes. Really, they're giving you a medium so that you don't have to spend your gold or whatever. This is why fiat money works the way that it does. This is more complicated than I'm just saying, but the federal government in this case, or the Congress, the Confederacy, the Confederate Congress, basically said, you cannot pay us in your paper money. You have to pay us in actual specie. And this was a big problem because specie was in fairly short supply. One of the great difficulties that the United States had after independence was that the British said, well, okay, fine, we're not going to be at war anymore, but we're not going to allow you to operate the transatlantic carrying trade. So if you're going to trade with us, your ships cannot come to our ports. We have to carry all your goods. And this function to restrain trade, also, the British said, your ships cannot go to our Caribbean possessions. Now that's a big deal, because the Caribbean is where the money is, fundamentally. I mean, later on, the British Empire sort of diversified into other places, but in the late 18th century, the money was in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Losing North American colonies was not a good outcome for them, but losing Barbados or whatever would have been a much bigger deal, because a sugar plantation is a real money spinner as long as you can have access to slave labor, because it's extremely unhealthy. In order to pay the money that they owed, I mean, the states would say, well, why don't we just do this? We'll just pay our domestic creditors, right? To which the federal government would say, well, no, the country contracted these debts, right? So the country needs to pay them. So it would it's not going to work if Connecticut pays off the debts owed to Connecticut bondholders, but Massachusetts bondholders get hung out. There was a problem with increasingly severe taxation, and this is a country that's very agrarian. Now, one way that it's very different than Great Britain is that a much larger proportion of people, something like 80%, had real property, had land. You have much more actual land holding. I mean, this is something that's really very different in the kind of like civilizational understanding of the world of Americans vis-a-vis British. So you have a nation of, to a great extent, farmers, and the states start raising taxes and being very aggressive about collecting back taxes. And this causes a lot of dissatisfaction. And so what you get is these populist politicians, one of whom is John Hancock, ironically enough, who becomes governor of Massachusetts, whose answer to this and whose way of staying popular is, well, we're just going to put out paper money. Fiat currency systems get kind of a bad rap. People say, oh, well, inflation is inherent in a fiat currency system, which is not necessarily true. There's a lot of scholarship about this that I won't bother going into, but this is not what was happening. So Rhode Island issued so much paper currency that it was trading at like 1/8 of its value or something like that. I mean, it really, but the thought was, if we put out this paper currency, then the farmers will have money to pay their taxes with. The problem being that the federal government will then not accept this money as payment for the debt. And in fact, in the sort of series of requisitions that the government made, I think it was Pennsylvania that paid in 1781 20% of what they were asked for, and then in 1785, I think, paid nothing. And New Jersey said, well, we're not going to pay. New Jersey, I think, had paid a little more in the first one and said, well, we're not going to pay anything until Pennsylvania and New York pay their bit. So you had this kind of standoff. But what was a bigger problem was what's called impost. The federal government did not, under the Articles of Confederation, have the right to regulate trade globally, so to speak, or nationally. So what you got was foreign countries, and by foreign countries here I mean the British, shopping around to try and sort of play states against each other in terms of what their tariff legislation was going to be. And you got some states that got really jammed by this, particularly, so northern states, particularly Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, tended to have very good harbors, very extensive merchant fleets. Southern states, not quite so much, with the exception of South Carolina. When I mention New York and Pennsylvania, I do not mention the intervening state, New Jersey. And New Jersey kept feeling kind of burned because they couldn't get in on the trade that New York and Pennsylvania was doing. So New Jersey started setting up tariff barriers against New York and Pennsylvania because they thought that they were leaking money because they didn't have a port in the way that Philadelphia or New York were major ports. So debt once again gets back to the taxation issue. What you have is a large number of people, particularly in the sort of agrarian population, who are having their farms seized. Starting in 1781, you start hearing some real grumblings. There was some disturbances in South Carolina, in the Tidewater part of Virginia, and also in Massachusetts, among people saying, well, we were kind of better off under the British, right? We weren't getting our farms seized, we didn't have this horrific taxation. This eventually breaks out in a rebellion in western Massachusetts. It's now called Shays Rebellion because of the leader. A number of the locals in various areas in western Massachusetts started attacking tax collectors, started destroying and burning the documents, the taxation documents. This is in 1785. The federal government has a real problem here. Because these people are saying, there's a lot of talk that says, well, forget this liberal democratic system. Well, they didn't use the word liberal back then, but you know what I'm saying. Forget this new republic we have. Let's go back to England, because basically the republic is just an excuse for us to get drained of our money and property. So the federal government has a problem. And number one problem is they cannot raise troops under the Articles of Confederation except to fight the Indians. So they engage in this weird sort of subterfuge where they say, yeah, there's definitely Indian trouble. We're going to raise 4,200 troops and head out. George Washington was involved, so was Alexander Hamilton. And we're going to go out and sort out this problem with the Indians, the native people, as we'd call them now. And nobody really hiccuped at this because they knew that it had to be done, right? So they end up going out there, and it all ends pretty peaceably. Shays flees to Connecticut, and eventually is kind of rehabilitated. There's a sort of an amnesty later on. The sort of collective effect of this was to illustrate to people in sort of political classes of the country, people like Monroe and Madison, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, that the Articles of Confederation were not going to work in the long term. Hamilton, Madison are very concerned that the country is going to fly apart. George Washington writes in a letter, if we don't come up with a sort of solution to this, then the Republic is done for. And all the things we fought for are going to go away. So we need to come up with some sort of way of organizing ourselves that's going to work on a kind of a long-term basis. So the most burning issue is the trade issue. And they decide they're going to have a meeting in Annapolis. It happens from the 11th to the 14th of September 1786 at Mann's Tavern, which was a sort of large complex of buildings. Like there's some other stuff there now. But they solicited representatives from all of the colonies. In fact, only representatives from New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia came. Now, this may seem like a small subset, except that Pennsylvania and Virginia are the two largest colonies by population. Interestingly, delegates from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and North Carolina failed to arrive in time. Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia didn't respond to the summons. Ironically, since the thing is happening in Maryland, the state of Maryland did not send a representative. But it became clear fairly quickly in the course of these discussions, although the various states recognized the difficulties with trade particularly, they were very hinky about conceding their sovereignty. While this is going on too, so you saw in the earlier map the sort of control that the Spanish had from large parts of the sort of western North America, what is now the United States. And one big problem was that they had control of the lower part of the Mississippi River. And this, once again, functioned to restrain trade. They had a deal with the British, U.S., that British trade could go through and down into New Orleans. But after the war, they said, well, that deal was with the British, not you guys. And there's a sort of long negotiation that goes on between John Jay and a representative of the Spanish government, at which the representative of the Spanish government says, look, we're not going to concede free navigation of the Mississippi to you. Period. The King of Spain just absolutely will not do that. We will sign a trade deal with you if you will concede that we have control of this. But as far as free navigation goes, that's not on the table. And the northern states said, well, that's fine. We don't care. We have these wonderful ports. But the southern states, because they did not have access to the facilities that the North had, and because, so in this period, large numbers of people are moving from Virginia and the Carolinas into that western backcountry that will become Kentucky, Tennessee. And these people are very interested in getting access to the Mississippi River, because that's the way they can move their crops to places that people will buy them, their products to places that people will buy them. Jay says, well, look, he comes back to the Confederacy Congress and says, look, I think we should just do this deal. And the reason is because eventually the weight of population growth out there is going to be such that the question will be moot. We'll just be able to compel them. And in fact, the alternative is we fight a war with Spain that we can't win. And the Northerners said, yeah, that sounds like a fantastic idea, because they really didn't care. I mean, it wasn't an important issue for them. But the Southerners, whose sympathies were with their sort of compatriots out in the bush, started accusing John Jay of, all sorts of every sin in the calendar, because they said, well, he's not defending the national interest. He's conceding to Spain the idea that we would not have free navigation to the Mississippi. One thing that's going on, this is part of the kind of dynamic that's driving this idea that the federal government needs to have power to regulate trade, and that you cannot have imposts between states. But the states say, well, no, that's a violation of our sovereign power. And so this meeting breaks up pretty quickly. It only lasts 3 days. The sort of leading figure there is Alexander Hamilton, one of the most notorious Federalists. I mean, there's the factions that get set up here are the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. It's funny that the terms have come to be completely reversed now. But The Federalists in those days were people who believed that we needed a strong central government. Now, if you go to the meeting of the Federalist Society and take this point of view, they will not be too thrilled about it. But then, federalism was about strong central government, and Hamilton was such a sort of committed federalist that a lot of people thought, and by a lot of people I mean a lot of people in sort of political classes, thought that he was like a crypto-royalist, that he either wanted to sort of bring back, in connection with Britain, or set up a kind of monarchical system here, which is not true. Like if you look at if you read what he wrote, this was not what he wanted. But he really did think that you needed a very strong federal government, and he would later go on to sort of, if you look at the system that he proposes in the course of the Constitutional Convention, he really thinks, well, states, who needs them? Let's just have a strong federal government, and we can use the states as kind of like aggregators for sort of like political districts or whatever. But the idea that a state, you would view a state as almost a kind of its own sovereign entity, Hamilton thought that was an absurd idea. So this meeting breaks up in about 3 days because they realize that A, there's not enough people there, but B, there isn't the sort of readiness on the part of the states to concede their sovereignty. There's a number of things that go on starting in the early 1780s, attempts to reconfigure the Articles of Confederation. Part of the problem with the Articles of Confederation was if you were going to change anything in the Articles of Confederation, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree to it. You needed a supermajority. But you couldn't get 9 of the 13 states to agree that grass was green. So it meant that there was a very intensely conservative, and by conservative I mean allergic to change sort of dynamic built into the system. And Madison in particular keeps sort of promoting this idea that we're going to have a sort of trade agreement. They keep trying to sort of do it in various different ways. And it keeps getting sort of rejected. And so finally they say, look, like we need to have a kind of convention where everyone shows up and where we have a serious discussion about the problems with the Articles of Confederation. So they decide that they're going to get together, they send out invitations, they're going to meet in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia in May of 1787. They send invitations to everybody, and everybody sends representatives, except, does anyone know which state?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. And I think I have this marked properly. This is, by the way, there is a dearth of really good books about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There's Miracle at Philadelphia, which is, I think, just okay. But I recently read this book, The Framers' Coup by Michael Klarman. It's a bit of a wrist tester, and the text is a little bit small. It's 600 and something pages long. This much of it is notes. I mean, it's very well researched. Like if you go and look at the footnotes, like he was very thorough. I think it's a great book. It's really very entertaining for a couple of reasons. There's a wealth of kind of interesting quotes, and one of them is when Madison was informed that Rhode Island wasn't going to be showing up, he said, "If her deputies should bring with them the complexion of the state, their company will not add much to our pleasure or to the progress of business." Rhode Island was the most notorious of the paper-emitting states. And so the other states were not really that thrilled with them because whereas you might in those days, I mean, so very much this was a sort of, the gold standard was the gold standard in those days, so to speak. That is to say, specie, metallic money was the preferred medium of exchange. The premise was that you could, if you had notes, that you could, if you wanted to, exchange those notes for a fixed amount of the currency metal. They were not really that bummed out that Rhode Island showed up, and then Rhode Island was like the last state to ratify the Constitution, just to sort of, as a kind of thumb your nose to the others. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to tell you why I think this book is great. It's full of really interesting little details. So one of the sort of main figures was a fellow named Gouverneur Morris. He had been involved in the revolutionary government, and he was a really interesting figure, but also apparently a very consummate womanizer. Not to put too fine a point on it. And at one point, John Jay wrote this letter to Robert Morris, who was not related but was his boss in the government. Gouverneur Morris, he wasn't the governor. His first name was Gouverneur, which is a very odd name, but there you go. But he had been in a carriage accident and had to have his leg amputated. John Jay wrote this letter to Robert Morris, in which he said, "Governor's leg has been a tax on my heart. I am almost tempted to wish he had lost something else." So anyway, Klarman records like lots and lots of interesting little tidbits like that, which I think makes this book a really good one. So they get together, and the sort of premise is, well, we're going to fix the problems with Articles of Confederation. So the first two groups of delegates who get there are Pennsylvania, not surprisingly, because they don't have to come very far, and Virginia. And now, once again, Virginia is the most populous of the colonies, if you count the slave population, which becomes a very big issue, which we will return. But they get there kind of early, and they all get together, the Pennsylvania deputies and the Virginia deputies, and they have this dinner at Franklin's house, at which Madison sort of says, well, the deal has been so far that we were going to fix the Articles of Confederation, but I have this plan that what we really need to do is just start from scratch here and write a fundamental new document. People were actually remarkably sympathetic to this, although there were some very profound doubts about doing so, and we can get to why in a minute. Just to sort of back up for a moment, they had finally, after a lot of hemming and hawing, gotten George Washington to chair the first, to be the chair, the sort of chair of the convention. And for a long time, he had said no. And there were two reasons. One was he was the head of an organization called the Order of Cincinnatus, the Order of the Cincinnati, who were Revolutionary War veterans. And it was also, or their descendants. It was officers, yeah, correct. But if you were, but it was hereditary too. So if your father had been a member, you could be a member too, correct. Washington was afraid that, Washington was generally afraid that this looked like a kind of aristocracy, so he wanted to be a little careful about it. But they were having a conference in Philadelphia at the same time, and he had said, they had asked him to attend, and he had said no. So he didn't want to show up to this and then look like he was snubbing them. But he also was very, Madison was sort of telling him what he thought the deal was going to be through intermediaries. And Washington was like, well, I don't think that's going to be successful, and I don't know if I want to be associated with it. He was finally sort of convinced, you occupy this, like it or not, you occupy a certain position in the national understanding of things, and we need to have you there because otherwise there's no way this works. The chances that this will work without your participation, so you've just got to suck it up and go. And he finally, very late in the game, I think he didn't agree to come until maybe sometime in February 1787. But he shows up for the thing. So the first quorum doesn't happen until the 25th of May. Once again, they get George Washington. It takes a long time to get around. This is why the inauguration doesn't happen until the election happens in November. The inauguration happens sometime in January, because when they were arranging this in the first place, it takes a while to get from place to place. You couldn't just like jump on the Acela and head down from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. in 4 hours or whatever. But they decide that the discussions are going to be held in secret. And there's a minority among the deputies who say, well, wait, that's not cool. Like if we're going to be talking about a new founding document for the country, these discussions have to be held publicly, right? To which Madison says, no. We're going to be sort of voting on ideas. And if it happens in public, that means, we may reconsider them later. And if you voted one way, it's going to make it very hard for you to reconsider it later down the road. So the rule is nobody is allowed to talk to the media, so to speak, about what's going on in here. It's just going to be, we're going to have these debates, and we're going to have them as secret because we want to have people be free to change their mind if that's what they're going to do. At the dinner at Franklin's house, Madison starts discussing what he calls what comes to be called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan involves bicameral legislature, that is to say, two houses. The Confederation Congress only had one. In the lower house, they hadn't come up with the names for the houses yet. I think that the idea of calling it the Senate didn't come until the sort of later on, and in fact doesn't come until they sort of work it out a little further. But in the lower house, it's going to be, there's rotation in office, that is to say you can only serve, I think, for 3 years of any 6-year period is in the proposal. You can be recalled. Representation is going to be proportional. There's some debate about whether representation is going to be proportional to the population or to the tax contribution of the state. The issue of representation based on the proportion becomes an issue later on, as I mentioned, because of the issue of the slave population. And that there's going to be sort of checks and balances among the sort of various parts of the government. And this is a plan that appeals to the larger states, right? To Virginia, to Pennsylvania, to New York. Why? Because in the lower house, at the very least, they're going to be the most powerful because they have the largest populations and they are going to be the largest, the states making the largest tax contributions. So William Patterson, who's one of the representatives from New Jersey, offers, in the course of the discussions, an alternative plan. A unicameral house, that's one house. Interestingly, Franklin really loved this idea. Franklin was didn't like the idea of a bicameral house because he thought it looked too much like the British House of Lords versus House of Commons. Each state would get one representative. What happens is what's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. We'll get to that in a minute. There were other plans being offered. One was by Alexander Hamilton, bicameral house. The federal government would have veto power over all laws promulgated by the states. And it essentially involved eliminating the sovereignty of the states to a very great degree. And this is very much commensurate with Hamilton's idea about political organization. Hamilton was very much into a sort of unified executive power structure. And then there was what's called the Pinckney Plan, proposed by Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, a bicameral house, president appointed by Congress, but sovereignty resides within the states in the Pinckney Plan. What happens to sort of get the two sides together is what's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. The idea of this is there's going to be a lower house where states will be represented in proportion to their population, and then an upper house where each state will have two representatives. That will be the Senate. The name for the Senate, I think, only comes around sort of toward the end of the process, but that's what it was. Once this gets proposed, you see a sort of very pronounced change in the atmosphere of the Constitutional Congress because a lot of the smaller states get on board for the project. A lot of the small states had been very hinky about this project to begin with. But once you say, okay, we're going to have this upper house, everybody gets two representatives in it, everybody gets two people in it, then that means that they can't get overborne or that they have some defense against getting overborne by the power of the larger states. So how is this going to get organized? Well, what comes up pretty quickly when you start talking about the representation on proportion of population is the issue of the slave population. And this is an issue with a very pronounced regional flavor to it. So this is the estimated population of the colonies in 1780. Here in the northern colonies, you find the population of 1.2 million, 1.3 million roughly, 53,000 blacks, whereas in the south you find 1.33 million, 500,000. Yes?
How did they count the number?
Probably by the tax rolls, I would guess, but I'm not exactly sure how it was compiled, I have to admit. So this is a 1790 census, and one thing you'll notice here is that they distinguish between the slave population and the free non-white population, and that really became an issue. So what you see is, in the north, a population of 1.8 million and 40,000 slaves. So the slave population is 2.1% of the population. In the south, the population is 1.9 million with 654,000 slaves. The proportion of slaves in the population runs pretty steadily at about 34% up into the 1840s. And interestingly, so there was one sort of subject of discussion at this time was like whether the slave system is going to continue or whether it's going to go away. And if you look, so I'll just show you this. This is the 1820 census. Once again, 34%. The proportion has remained exactly the same. Although the population has gone from, in the south, has gone from 1.9 million to 4.4 million, the number of slaves has kept pace. South Carolina, between 1800 and 1820, I think, imported 40,000 slaves. A lot of the northern states say, well, these people aren't voters, right? So why is it that you get to count them? And the southern states, well, said, well, they are part of our population. So the compromise that they come to is more than slightly revolting, but really got the job done in this case, which is that slaves will count as 3/5. An individual slave will count as 3/5 of a person. And this is, thinking about it in our sort of more civilized way of thinking is a pretty revolting way of looking at a human being. And in fact, like, if you look at the reality of the slave system, 3/5 was in a weird way kind of overvaluing, given the way those human beings were actually treated. If you've watched the Ken Burns documentary, that there's a very profound interview that was recorded with a guy who was a freed slave, and he said, if I thought I was going to go back and be a slave on one of those big plantations, I'd just kill myself because, you're not even a dog. You're worse. You're in a worse condition than that. The sort of northern states were willing to compromise and say, and go along with this sort of 3/5 idea. Now, later on, so there's a kind of a debate that goes on, and I'll talk about this more when I talk about the Federalist Papers and Hamilton and the ratification, which is lecture number 4. At a certain point in the 1780s, early 1780s, Patrick Henry gives this sort of speech in the Virginia House of Delegates, in which he says, like, one of the big things that happened in the South was slave patrols. Like, so the whites in the South were afraid that they were going to be killed by their slaves, not surprisingly. And so there's a big debate that goes on about to what extent the South was interested when the Bill of Rights came around in including the Second Amendment, because they were afraid, and in fact, Patrick Henry says this explicitly, that the Northerners won't let us have slave patrols and we'll all be killed. And he gets so sort of worked up about it that I'm trying to remember Patrick Henry or George Mason or one of those guys is, slow your roll a little bit. I don't think it's quite to that place yet. Just to sort of preface what I'll say at a later point, it's not like you can look at the Second Amendment and say, like, that was the only reason. There were it was a complex thing, but that was part of it too. Like, the Southerners were very worried that if they weren't allowed to have slave patrols, because the Northerners, it's interesting too that the Northern view toward slavery was not, for most people, predicated on the idea that blacks were equal to whites. But they thought that slave owning was just kind of bad for civilization. And you see Hamilton in his debates with Jefferson. Hamilton and Jefferson really hated each other. Really profoundly hated each other. So that Jefferson formed a newspaper which was predominantly centered on printing bad things about Hamilton. And Hamilton, at a certain point, through sort of mutual friends, when Jefferson is in Paris, knows that he's brought Sally Hemings with him. And sends a kind of veiled threat, not about the paper, it was about something else, but kind of makes a kind of comment that Jefferson clearly reads as a veiled threat that, if you don't lighten up, I'll just tell everybody that you're sleeping with one of your slaves. Hamilton, I think, is emblematic in this because Hamilton, always thought, well, Hamilton actually had, I think, very enlightened ideas about blacks relative to other people around at the time. But, Hamilton sort of says, it's funny that the Southerners are always talking about liberty when these people own human beings, right? They own lots of people. So it's a little rich for them to sort of talk about, liberty and the dangers of their liberty when when they're slave owners. And even, Jefferson at one point says, slavery, the slave system is like having a wolf by the ears. You didn't really like it, but you couldn't safely let it go either. And this is, if you want to call it that, the more enlightened thinking about it among Southerners. Like, there were some Southerners who saw at least some of the problems with it, although once again, we shouldn't kind of read our sort of modern ideas about racial equality back into the 18th century. There were some people who did hold relatively enlightened views. Most people did not. Although it was very different here than in Europe, depending on where you were, I guess. The Tariff Compromise, or the Commerce Compromise, basically was essentially the writing into the Constitution of the idea that you could have tariff barriers, but only to goods coming into the country from foreign countries. So New Jersey cannot, put a tariff barrier on New York or Pennsylvania. So the northern states wanted to abolish the slave trade. Once again, not directly out of solicitude for the blacks, but because they thought that it was bad for their civilization. I mean, the white people's civilization. So they made this sort of compromise. One was that to get the sort of southern states on board with this thing, they would wait till 1808 before they would pass a law banning the slave trade. But, and this is perhaps one of the most key sort of moments in American history, they would allow the promulgation of a fugitive slave law so that Southerners could pursue their slaves into the non-slave states, which resulted in two very unfortunate consequences. One was it forced the local authorities in the non-slave states to assist the Southerners in recovering their property. But number two, one practical result was that thousands of free blacks in the North were just seized and sent to the South into slavery. And this is one of the most profound consequences of the whole process, because when you get around to the time of the Civil War in the late 1850s and 1860s, one of the big reasons that, I'm getting a little off topic here, but I'll say it because I think it's worth thinking about in American history. You'll hear people say, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Like, you know, if you ask the Northerners, mostly what they were fighting for, it was about preservation of the Union. And a sort of more aggressive group will say, well, the Southerners really was about states' rights. I mean, really, let's be clear, it was about one state's right, the right to keep human beings as chattel. But the Northerners, and I think it's fair to say this, there's a very pronounced abolitionist movement in the North. Many of them wanted, after abolition, for the slaves to go back to Africa. There's a very interesting moment where Lincoln held this view, and then a bunch of leaders of the black community came to him and said, look, like, we're Americans. This is, you know, we don't want to go back to Africa. We want to be Americans and free here. And Lincoln, to his credit, I think really changed his views. But one of the real irritations among Northerners leading up to the Civil War was that they were being compelled, authorities in the North were being compelled to assist in the recovery of fugitive slaves. This was a real irritation among Northerners, and one reason why Northerners were so adamant about pursuing the Civil War, for whatever that's worth. And the Electoral College. Okay, so this has come up. The Electoral College has come up as a sort of issue, and I think we don't need to discuss any further its modern implications, but there was a sort of fear. So in those days, the word democracy had a very different flavor than it does today. Now we think of democracy, we think, yeah, democracy, it's really great. Back then, democracy really meant, had a sort of flavor that was a little closer to anarchy, right? The idea that, I mean, there's a very funny moment sort of in the English Civil War, where in the New Model Army, where Cromwell and his sort of Ireton have come along and said, well, you know, the people need to rule England. And then a bunch of levelers in the New Model Army came along and said, yeah, that's great. You know, we think that, and Cromwell, they have a meeting at Putney Church, and Cromwell said, well, you know, when I meant the people, I didn't mean you. I meant us, like the sort of better class of people. But so the Electoral College is basically developed as a sort of way of blunting the force of the unpredictable masses. And let's be clear too, so what's going on here, what's going on in North America, what's going on in the United States, is a sort of wager on a new form of government and a new civilization, right? Like really, if you look around Europe at that time, this is the age of absolutism. You know, we're not too far along from Henry XIV or Louis XIV saying, you know, the state is me, which he may or may not have said, but the reason why it sticks around as a quote is because it's very consonant with the idea of absolutism. Like, the state is embodied literally in the person of the king. This is why, you know, in King Lear in Shakespeare, when the king goes crazy, like it's storming all around, because he physically is the state, right? The English are a little peculiar in this sense because they have a kind of constitutional monarchy, which is pretty unexampled. If you look at the sort of states of Europe at this time, much less anywhere else. But even given that the framers are willing to sort of wager on the idea of elections, they still want to kind of limit it by adding in this layer of protections against the people doing something really, loose. I mean, Hamilton, I think, is once again, yes?
Can I make a couple points?
Please do.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
So, just real quick, the 3/5 rule was used before
Right, yeah.
for taxation.
Yeah, you're certainly right.
The irony was, at the time, the Southerners didn't like the 3/5 rule. Now they like.
Right, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Slave trade originally, the original compromise was 1800 for importation.
Right,
It got changed at the end by Rutledge and his guys from South Carolina.
right,
And the Electoral College was really more about protecting, again, against one state or one area dominating
right.
the electoral election of anything. So that was really what it was. In Washington, who, just so you know, on the Washington thing, one of Washington's biggest concern with going to the convention was getting back into public life.
Right,
He felt he had promised he was not doing that when he, in his first exit, in his first farewell address, when he gave back his reins to Congress as the head of the Army.
sure, yeah.
FYI.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, it is true. Once again, you have people like Hamilton who are very not convinced that, or sort of more interested in the idea of that people who know how to run things should run things rather than. So Hamilton is constantly in the course of the debate sort of militating against this idea that, that plan that he proposes very much de-emphasizes the sort of mass participation as opposed to experts. The document itself goes through a series of draftings. I think the common view now is that Governor Morris did most of the actual drafting, that he drafted the preamble. So they wrote in the preamble, they wrote the sort of main body about which they'd been debating, and then they wrote a kind of like coda at the end. And the idea was to sort of give the impression that they all agreed, which was not, in fact, the case. So they come around to signing it on the 17th of September, 1787. This didn't come out very well, but this is a list of the delegates to the convention, and you'll see these asterisks, and these asterisks are the people who then refused to sign the Constitution. Some of them had left, but some of them, like Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, an old Republican who thought that the Constitution gave too much power to the central government. About half of the Virginia delegation. George Mason doesn't sign, James McClurg doesn't sign. Edmund Randolph, who had been instrumental in putting together the convention in the first place, then refuses to sign the document that it produces. George Wythe refuses to sign. And this becomes the sort of precursor for a long period of debate in the process of ratifying the Constitution, which I'll get into next time. And the skeleton of what I'm going to talk about next time is going to be the Federalist Papers, which is a series of essays that were composed predominantly by Alexander Hamilton, but also by Madison. And Jay became ill sort of I think Jay only wrote like, what? Yes. He became ill. I think he only wrote like 6 of them. But there's a very intense debate that goes on in the United States in the course of ratification, in which people are really wanting to sort of discuss what the sort of formation of a kind of federal entity that has control over the country and which seems to detract from the sovereignty of the individual states. To what extent that is commensurate with the revolutionary heritage, to what extent that's commensurate with liberty as they have understood it in North America so far. But the thing I'll just close by saying the thing I find really remarkable about the Constitutional Convention of 1787 is that it happened at all. Because the switch that goes on between the Annapolis Convention and Philadelphia is quite remarkable. a lot of what I've read, and this, Klarman, I think, is very pronounced about this, it wasn't until there was that sort of moment when the Great Compromise happens that this really became a viable project. People were willing to talk about it. I'm really kind of surprised that people were willing to talk about it in the way that they were. Because the states were so vociferous about, were so jealous of their rights, were so jealous of like the sovereignty of the courts in their own states, that I mean, it's remarkable to me that they managed to put this meeting together, but it's also, the more you read about it, the more you find that the more remarkable it seems that we go from this condition of relatively divided individual states to a state, to an entity, a political entity, united. Yes?
And along with what you're saying, I believe that part of what contributed to this ability to have more of a meeting of the minds was the fact that the Congress was able to ratify the Northwest Ordinance. They were able to agree on that and actually get it ratified and made into law before there was a Constitution. And I would recommend to anybody who's as interested as some of you are to be here tonight, that you read David McCullough's newest book, The Pioneers, that deals wonderfully with that Northwest Ordinance and the Northwest Territories and the beginning of our state, Ohio. It's a terrific read, and it's not real long, and it's very entertaining. And one of his main points is that the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territories, which would become Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And there were a bunch of people in New England who were very abolitionist based on religion and morality. And David McCullough brings that out in that book, that the Cutlers, Manasseh Cutler and his son, Ephraim Cutler, stood strong against slavery in what became Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
Well, yeah, there's two separate Congresses, you gotta remember. You know, the Congress that was being, that was a pretty amazing time frame, because that simultaneous to the Constitutional Convention was the Articles of Confederation Congress. The Confederation Congress was meeting in New York.
Right.
And that's why if you read a lot about some of the compromises, you'll see that there's only 11 states that actually vote sometimes.
Right.
Because New York is only usually represented by one person and had to have two. That one person was Colonel Hamilton.
Right.
So it even says the several states and Colonel Hamilton sometimes.
Right.
But that whole Northwest Ordinance, it was probably the only thing that the Confederation did of any substance in its entire existence. And it happened at the same time that the real pioneers, or the real founders of our country, were meeting over in Philadelphia.
Right.
Because if you remember too, a lot of the great people like the Patrick Henrys and others were not represented on the on the Confederation Congress,
right,
because they didn't put a lot of stock into it.
Right.
They were more concerned about the real leaders, if you were elected to their state legislature, not to the Confederation Congress.
David McCullough points out, though, that there's a real crossover between the two groups you're talking about, and that was Manasseh Cutler. He went to both groups.
Manasseh Cutler, they would call him the first lobbyist. He went with one thing, it was the Ipswich Therapy.
Right.
He was from Ipswich, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
He went there for that one purpose, to make sure that the Northwest Ordinance was going to be free of slaves.
Right.
And ironically, at the same time in Philadelphia, you had John Rutledge, Charles Pinckney,
right,
and others from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, who were there for one purpose, to protect slaves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's where it was really interesting and defining. And that's why when you even read where they signed, they're really not signing that they endorsed it. They signed as almost like an attestation that, yes, this is what happened.
Right. Right, yeah.
Because no one would have probably signed it if they said they had to endorse the whole thing, because it was such a compromised document.
Right.
So many compromises. but it has held up over the years.
One quote that I thought was particularly, so, I mean, your point about, by the way, just as a sort of fact about Hamilton, he was going to go, and the governor of New York was an anti-federalist and wanted to make sure that Hamilton wasn't going to, like, commit New York to all sorts of things. So he picked two anti-federalists, knowing that there would have to be, in order to vote, they would have to have two of the three, and then they left, just to sort of throw it in Hamilton's face. But let me see if I can find this one quote, and then I will let you go. Alexander Hamilton referred to the Constitution as a weak and worthless fabric, certain to be superseded. Luther Martin from Maryland described it as a stab in the back of the goddess of liberty. But Madison was reasonably, I think, was reasonably happy about what had come out of it. So, but next time we'll talk about the sort of complex process of ratification and how Federalist Papers function as a kind of argumentative structure to try and sort of convince people that the sort of loss of state sovereignty is going to be compensated for by a federal structure that will compensate the loss of the state power with an ability to promote the general welfare that will be better for the country generally. But anyway, thanks so much for coming out, and I will see you guys next time.